Good morning and welcome to our Bible study this morning. We'd like to welcome you to the Farmington Church of Christ. We worship here on Sunday mornings. Our Bible class is at 9:30 and we are going through the book of Acts. We have several great teachers for that. Jared Pack is teaching a young adult class. We have others that are teaching another adult class, and then the auditorium, which is taught by me, John Merritt, and Bob Bila. And so those are the classes, as well as the young children. We have in-person classes, and we would like to invite you to those for all ages. On Sunday night at 5 o'clock, we have an in-person worship time. Wednesday night, we have two adult classes, one taught by me on Bible morals and ethics. That will be in the auditorium. And we are looking at the idea of, can a Christian go to war? We're going to look at war in general. And then Jared is teaching a class on Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Romans 15, the Bible says, the things are written for our time were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And so the Old Testament is such a rewarding study. And we invite you to those classes. If you will go to the Farmington Church of Christ and look at the website and join, become a part of that, and you'll get notifications and everything else. But we have our worship service on there, and we are in the process of trying to go live. We also have our Bible classes, and if you go down from where it has the worship to the Bible classes, you can find our Bible classes there. If you'd also like, you can go to YouTube, and on YouTube type in Farmington Church of Christ, and you can pull up most of the time our latest recordings. So we give you an invite to all of those classes. This morning what I want to do is we continue, and this is lesson number 5, on urban legends. And I know what we hear sometimes with a child. There was a period where we went through what psychiatrists called regressive hypnosis. And it was proven that if you were to say to a child and ask them a story and they didn't quite remember, or they didn't know, or it didn't happen, after 5 mentions, they would start adding detail to the story, their own detail, even if it didn't happen to them. And I think many times what happens is when we are looking at the Bible and we know the stories and we know them so well, so we don't pay attention like we should. Another idea is that we make up our own details. Words change meaning. Not only do they change meaning, some words become obsolete. They're no longer used. And so here's what we find as we're looking at the Scriptures. We need to try and find out just exactly what the hearers of the original word, what they understood it to mean, because it's got to mean the same thing. And so many times what we do is we look at words and the word has lost its meaning, or a word is used and we put a 2021 meaning on that word that it was not meant to portray. And so the question this morning that we're asking is, Jesus was a carpenter. Let's read in the book of Mark chapter 6 and in verse 3, and it's used twice. I want us to notice in Mark chapter 6 and in verse 3, it states there, is this not the carpenter? And from this, we would assume, man, it's being nailed down. He's nothing but. He cannot be anything except a carpenter. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not these his sisters? And they were offended at him. And so it's used twice, and in this particular text, we have the word, is this not the carpenter? And we assume it has to be the carpenter. But here's what we find. What does a carpenter do? You know, a carpenter is someone who builds, he repairs, he works with wood. And you think about the old wooden doors that Jesus would take off an old wooden door and take it off its hinges. And he would begin to scrape off, peel off the layer after layer and layer of paint. And sometimes paint is not used to decorate something as much as it's used to hide the imperfections. And so Jesus, he'd take the door, he would take it to his workbench, and he would start taking off the paint. And finally he'd get down and he would see the imperfections. And he didn't see the door for what it was, but what it could be, and bring glory to the carpenter. I remember going just out of Somerton, between Somerton, Alabama and Birmingham, Alabama. I believe the barbecue place is called Green Hill. It was painted green, and you go inside, even the walls were green. And what happened was it had been painted so many times that you could not see the light switch. The paint was so thick, it had come out to be equal with the light switches. And so when you're restoring something or you want to go back, you have to take all of that, the facade, the paint that is covering up the imperfection. And most time people use a cheap paint, and it covers up the imperfections. And so God, Christ, would peel all that off. He would sand away the rough spots, and he would finish off with a beautiful coat, a coat of his righteousness, and it would bring glory to the carpenter. And so let's introduce this legend of the carpenter. The legend that we have now nailed down, that Jesus had to be a carpenter. And it's ingrained in us, and we almost think that it's sacrilegious for you to even mention something different than Jesus being a carpenter. It is so ingrained within us as American Christians that Johnny Cash wrote a song, and the song was called Jesus Was a Carpenter. And Cash thought that Jesus was such a good carpenter that part of the word says that his hands could form a table, a true table, true enough to stand forever. And so between Johnny Cash and some of the other urban legends that we've heard, Jesus has to be a carpenter. Josh McDowell in 1977 wrote a book, and the book was called More Than a Carpenter. Sold over 10 million copies. But does the scriptures really say that Jesus was a carpenter? In the book of Matthew chapter 15 and verse 55, The scriptures say, isn't this the carpenter's son? In the book of Mark 6 and verse 5, which we have just read, isn't this the carpenter's son? The son of Mary. And so it appears that explicitly Jesus has to be a carpenter's son. We would assume that Joseph, his father, was a carpenter, and a carpenter usually would hand down and apprenticed his son to be a part of the craft, the craftsmanship, the vocation, if you will, of the father. And that's why we find in the story of the son who inherited from his father a double portion. And that was that he could pay or keep the business going of his father. And so let's examine, and what we'll do is we will examine from the New English Standard Version. We will look at the NIV, the New International Version. We'll look at the King James Version. We will look at comparisons from the New King James Version, the New Living Translation, and the New English Bible. When we go back and we look at the old translations, the Latin Vulgate, if you will, completed in about AD 400, it refers to Jesus as a faber, F-A-B-E-R. And that means a craftsman. It means not one who just works with wood, but he is an artisan. More general term, if you will, more in line with the idea that Jesus was not specifically a carpenter, but an artisan, a craftsman. He wasn't limited. A very general term, if you will. When you go to the Wessex Gospels, that is the English translations completed in about 1000 AD, here's what we have. They called Jesus a smith. Jesus the smith, meaning one that works with metal. In Tyndale was completed in 1526, and what he uses is the idea of one who was a carpenter. And it seems like everyone after Tyndale, after 1526, fell in line with Tyndale and called Jesus a carpenter. Before that, there was disagreement. There was discussion about it. And the word that we get from the Greek is the word tekton. In Matthew chapter 13 and in Mark chapter 6. And from the Greek dictionaries, we get insight from this word, Jesus the tekton. And so, Thayer exclusively refers to Jesus with the idea of being a carpenter. But the Greek dictionary lists tekton, and it refers to someone who builds using whatever material is possible, be it wood, a carpenter, be it stone, a masonry, or being a smithy, or someone who works with iron. And so it's not defined in that very narrow idea of being a carpenter. Could Jesus have been a carpenter? Yes, he could. He could have worked with wood. But it also opens up with the idea that he was a builder. And as such, he would use such things as wood. He would use such things as stone. And he would use such things as a smithy, a iron worker. Whatever it took to build, that is what he would use. And I think another thing is that at the bottom of the dictionary, there is this line. It goes on and says that there was every reason to believe that in Bible times, one who regarded as a tecton would be skilled in wood, stone, and metal. And so it's not limited just to the idea of being someone who worked with wood. Think again. Did the description of tecton, someone who worked with wood, when Mark was writing this, I'm not too sure that he had the idea that people that were reading it would read it with the illustration that I began with, that as Jesus would take something off the hinge, he would peel away the paint, see the imperfections, fix the imperfections, and then cover it with a shiny coat of his righteousness. And that would bring glory to the artisan, to the carpenter. Mark was not thinking that when he wrote, "Is this not the carpenter's son? Is this not the son of Mary?" And so the word tecton is not isolated. It's not narrowed down. It carries with it a wider meaning. My twin brother started off as not so much just a carpenter, but what we would think of as a general contractor. He built beautiful houses, and he was rented out for his skills. He worked and he operated under a contractor. Until finally he decided, why should someone else be being paid for my skills? So he just opened his own company, Rain Construction. But he also went on and he worked with electricity and got certified at that and at plumbing. And so he could design your house, he could pour the foundation, he could build it, and he would give you the key for you to move in. He was a general contractor. He worked with whatever it took to build the house. And so in time, we have others who wrote. Epictetus, in AD 135, said that a tecton was a carpenter because he used an axe. But then Plutarch, in AD 120, said that a smithery worked with an axe. He wielded an axe also. And so, the two didn't quite agree. And then you have Philo, who was a first century Hellenistic or a Greek Jewish man. He lived in Alexandria. And he used the word as a manner consistent with the idea of a carpenter. But none of the examples demand that the word refers to carpentry. You have Josephus. Josephus died around the year AD 100. And he had two great works. The first one was the Antiquity of the Jews. The second great writing works that he had was called the War of the Jews. And it's strange that in the Antiquity of the Jews, when he used the word tecton, he was talking about someone who was a carpenter. But later on, and that would refer to someone who would be a woodworker in the tabernacle, the temple, maybe a palace. But then he goes and he writes in the War of the Jews, and what he does, he uses the word tecton there, and he gives a reference as to one who was given the duty of extending the height of a wall. In that time, the walls were not made of wood. And so in antiquity, if we go back and we look and we see what was used in the building of the walls. There, it can be wood, it can be metal, and it can be stone. But when he used it in the War of the Jews, the wording that he used there describes the job of masonry, not the job of a carpenter. And so we have early writers who use the word. But let's go back further and go back to the Old Testament as we look at the background of builders. And I think this is very helpful, especially as we start looking at the certain areas. The building of walls, temples, palaces involves the work of wood, masonry or stone, and metals. And so you have a very generalized, it's almost like saying now, I'm a doctor. Well, what sort of doctor are you? Well, I'm a GP, a family physician, a general physician. And so I know a little bit about several things. It was not specific, like if you came up and you said, well, I'm Dr. Rain, and you would say, well, what do you specialize in? Well, I specialize in neurology. I'm a neurologist, and I work on the brain. And so if you bring in the narrow meaning of Jesus being a carpenter, that's what you would use. I am a neurosurgeon. But that's not what he's called. He is called a faber. He is called a tecton, one who works with materials necessary for what he's doing. In the book of Exodus, chapter 35, beginning in verse 30 through 35, and it describes the work of Bezalel. Bezalel was a generalist. He worked with several materials. A little bit later on, Kevin Campbell, he analyzes and looks carefully at the different materials, the different word that's used there. And he states simply that Jesus did not limit himself. These builders, same word as used in the Old Testament, did not limit themselves to one material like wood. In the book of Nehemiah, chapter 3, verses 8 and in verses 31, here you find the idea of materials that were used being wood, stone, and iron. And so in the Old Testament, they did not specialize in one. They were just general contractors. So what is it that I need to build? And they could build with. And if you had a job description, you would simply put there general contractor. I work with wood. I work with stone. I work with iron or with metal. Whatever it takes to do the job that is what I use. And so as we look at the wording here, and we look at the meaning here of tecton, what conclusions can I draw? The word tecton there is simply someone who works with wood, stone, or metal. We would come closer to understanding what Jesus did if we just called him an artisan. And so Jesus did carpentry, but he also worked with stone and he also worked with metal. He was simply a general contractor. what can we learn in our lives? Is we analyze the scriptures and we look at the allegories that are used there, or maybe not. We would allegorize the story of Mark 6 when we think about Jesus taking the door, stripping the door, fixing the imperfections, polishing it over with his righteousness. But that's not what Mark had in mind when he wrote. The second is, it is important for you and I to be accurate when we're looking at, especially in the face of critics, when we're looking at Bible meanings. And so we need to be accurate. First, let's find out what he's saying, what the readers, the hearers of those days, what they understood in their hearts. The second, we must be accurate in the face of our critics. And then finally, through this, through our vocation, we can learn to be patient. The job that you have, the vocation that you have right now, may not be what you want to be. But you are in a place that God can use for whatever skills you need for where you want to be. I graduated from college and I started digging ditches in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where my wife was a nurse at Druid City Hospital. Well, I was not trained to dig ditches, but I was not too good either. There were no preaching jobs to be had. And so I dug ditches for Buckhannon Construction Company beginning in January. That's the middle of winter. And then I went and worked for Atasco in their appliance department. And in that job, I learned people skills. I learned how to deal with people. I learned management. I learned about dishonesty and how to correct those things. And so irrespective of where you are, the application that we can draw from this particular reading is that wherever you are, God is preparing you for where you want to be and need to be. And the skills that you are learning now, you will learn later on. There was an elderly black lady who walked into Otasco there in Tuscaloosa. The associate manager there was a very greedy man. And he saw this particular lady coming in, and to look at her, you would not think much of her. You wouldn't think that she had two nickels to rub together. I loved people. And so I went over and I talked to her, and I invited her to come sit down on one of the chairs there in the appliance department. And the first thing she did is she looked at my manager and she said, "I want one of those stogies." Well, I didn't know what a stogie was. And so I asked her, and she let me know what she wanted. She wanted one of the big cigars that the manager was smoking. And so I went over to Tommy and got a cigar and brought it back there and lit it up for her. We got to talking. And before she left, she bought a washer, a dryer, a stove, and a refrigerator from me, and she paid cash. I learned a lesson then. Do not judge people by their appearance. So you may not be where you want to be. Jesus' ultimate goal was not to be a carpenter, but God was taking him to where he would work in public ministry and becoming our Savior, the Savior of the world. And so I hope we've learned something from this. We're not interested in the urban legends that paint pictures for us. We're interested in being accurate and true to the scriptures and to the context and the culture trying to understand the best that we can what the original hearers understood in their hearts. We thank you for being with us. We invite you to come and to be with us at the Farmington Church of Christ. If you're unable, I am so proud that we have venues like this, avenues like this, where we can come into your home and study together. And so we have our Bible classes and our worships in the process of going live. They're there for you on our webpage. Thank you for being with us, and may God bless you for this day and for the great week that He has in store for you coming up.